I am a massive fan of these choice and consequence games. I've played everything from the likes of Life is Strange to the Dark Pictures games, and one game that I always had my eye on was As Dusk Falls. As Dusk Falls has a unique element to its presentation. This game is told in still images rather than the usual animation you'd regularly associate with these games. I genuinely came into this game knowing absolutely nothing about it, not even the basic premise. All I knew is that the game was called As Dusk Falls and that it was one of these choice and consequence games. But if I did know what this game was about before jumping in, I think I'd have jumped in sooner. As Dusk Falls does a hell of a lot right, but a couple issues here and there sadly prevent it from becoming a must-play of the genre. But let's start from the top. Here's the premise of the game. It's basically 6 chapters split into 2 3-chapter blocks. The first half of the game is set during a hostage situation, and the second half of the game is dealing with the aftermath of the hostage scenario. In the first half, you play as 2 different families. One family is forced to stay in a motel for a night while travelling cross country, when suddenly a group of criminals take them hostage inside. But here's the kicker. Not only do you play as one of the hostages, you also play as one of the criminals. The game gives you enough context and backstory for each of them that you don't really want the criminals to die or anything, but you also don't want the hostages to die either, so you've got to find the right balance to ensure that as many people make it out alive as possible. The game is of course told through still images, which can be a bit off-putting at first, but honestly, when you're playing you barely even notice. The writing and voice acting is so captivating that you just become so engrossed in the story that you don't really care. The voice acting especially is fantastic, and shines the most in one-on-one conversations. You feel the desperation emanating from their voices. Brilliant job all round from the cast. The game features a lot of flashbacks, and I mean a lot of flashbacks. The game jumps from the modern day to the past quite a lot, and it can be a bit jarring at times. It's usually to add extra context to the situation, in some cases making you do an entire 180 on your opinions of certain characters. If the game was set purely from the perspective of the hostages, you'd have very little care for the criminals. But since you'll play out flashbacks of the events that led them to doing this, you can't help but feel a little bit of empathy at the very least, and it does really complicate things. Sometimes though, it does feel a bit cheap, and the flashbacks do damage to the general pacing a fair amount. The choices you make in flashbacks can have direct consequences to the modern day, as decisions characters have made in the past affect other characters in the modern day. This presents an immersion issue. I was playing the game from the perspective of the character I was controlling, not from me as the player's perspective, so I would sometimes end up screwing myself over because I made a choice in a flashback that would have been an obvious choice for that character to make. Myself as the player, knowing full well it would fuck me over in another one of the characters later on in the story. I'll give an example. Spoilers for, I think it's chapter 4, skip to this time on screen to avoid it. When playing as Ash, I chose to tell Dante about the cabin, because there's no way in hell Ash wouldn't do that in this situation with a cop he trusts. This results in the police finding the cabin, and in my playthrough, I assume probably in combination with other choices I'd made, led to Tyler's death. The game features a lot of choice and consequence, more so than most games in the genre do, and it doesn't always work out weirdly enough. Some of the outcomes to certain decisions seem intentionally unrewarding. Of course, in real life, things aren't exactly as binary as video games normally show us. Sometimes the decision that makes the most sense on paper isn't always the correct decision, due to the unpredictability of life. And this game, whether intentionally or not, emulates that feeling quite a lot. It sometimes feels like you're being punished for making the right call, and I'm not sure if that's just a mistake on the game's part, or if it's part of its design to be that way. I will once again give an example, a major example in fact, also from chapter 4, so skip to this time to avoid the spoiler. At the start of the chapter, when playing as Jay, you can choose to let Vince out of the car or not, assuming Vince is with you. And let me explain why this choice and consequence makes zero sense, because I've thought long and hard about this. Tyler and Sharon are really not that far away from the car. They could notice Vince and they'd just catch him. He's not the most athletic of fellows, bless him. Once they catch him, they could do anything. Jay would also then be in serious trouble. So it just makes no sense to let Vince out of the car here. So I didn't let him out of the car, quite literally for his own safety. He then dies in a car crash minutes later. There is absolutely no way for the player to predict that scenario, and it feels like you're being punished for making the right call. It could just be that the developers didn't intend to use Vince much in the second half of the game, as it did feel very Jay-centric, and that maybe his story did what it needed in the first half. But even so, it did feel really cheap to lose him that way. So, it's ultimately up to you whether something like that would annoy you, or make you feel more immersed in the story. It's not a black and white, choose wisely game. It's you trying your best to navigate this unpredictable narrative, and it's up to you whether that's a good or bad thing. The game also features a hell of a lot of plot twists, a lot of which do actually come from the flashbacks, as I mentioned earlier. Some of them are well executed, but they generally seem to come completely out of left field and serve purely as shock value or to sour or sympathise your opinion on certain characters. I do think that the first half of the game was notably stronger than the second. The first half is full of tension, the criminals are scrambling, they're not confident, the hostages are searching for a way out, they don't know whether to trust the cops. There's generally a lot going on, and a lot of it is really subtle and well done, and this pin-dropping tension is just fantastic. The second half deals a lot more with the aftermath of whoever made it out alive, depending on your choices, and I feel it becomes inconsistent from that point onwards, introducing plot points that don't really go anywhere, although it's worth pointing out that this could be a result of my decisions cutting certain arcs short, preventing them from playing out as they otherwise could have. With that said, the whole point of a game where your decisions have consequences is multiple strands of satisfying narrative, which this game does have a lot of. I hope I'm not being misunderstood into saying that I think the second half is bad. It's not bad, it's just not as high quality as the first half. Characters start making decisions that seem nonsensical and exist to advance the plot and the plot alone. Vanessa especially. They try to add context into chapter 5 as to why she's doing what she's doing, but it's just not enough in my opinion. I won't give another spoiler warning or go into depth with it or anything, so you're safe here, but I just find it hard to believe that she'd do what she does in the second half of this game, despite the game's attempt at contextualising it. There are of course a bunch of different endings to the game, and mine was very underwhelming. The game reaches its pivotal crescendo, then undergoes a time skip over a decade. It feels to me like the final chapter should have been an epilogue, and that there should have been another chapter to bridge the two together, because it just feels a bit abrupt. The game also features a pretty dumb cliffhanger at the end in my opinion, which I'm not going to go into obviously. It has generated some theorising amongst the community, which is always nice, but it didn't have the intended effect on me. I kind of just rolled my eyes. My favourite thing about As Dusk Falls is the choice map at the end of each chapter, and it's similar to Detroit Become Human in the sense that there's clearly a bunch of branching paths you could have taken, and it does add a lot of replay value as you want to see this choice map filled in. The choice and consequence system in this game is generally a hell of a lot better than even some giants of the genre such as any Telltale game and the Life is Strange series, which are all generally great games that I do enjoy, but I have to admit the choice and consequence system aren't their strongest elements. As Dusk Falls is the opposite, where the choice and consequence system is the strongest element. I recognise that I have criticised As Dusk Falls quite a bit in this video, but that's only because I care about the game. They did a lot right, and had some very strong bones at the base of this thing. I love these type of games, and this really is one of the better ones. I can safely recommend this to anyone who's a fan of the genre, and if you can look past the still images, which I promise are barely even noticeable when you're immersed, then As Dusk Falls is a really good game that you should definitely try, and it was almost great. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. I hope that you did enjoy it. If you did, then please consider leaving a like, as that would greatly help me out. And if you want to see more videos from me, you could also consider subscribing, because I upload every single week. But that is all for now. Have a nice day, and goodbye.
How do we do this?
Friction, maybe?
Or we use scissors.